The first question I want to ask you is about Trump. I think it's the easier question. Then I want to get into some of the solidarity stuff, which I think is much more difficult. To what extent is it sort of refreshing that Trump is so, I don't know, idiotic or openly idiotic about his positions on Palestine? Because, I mean, kind of like you said, right? He's sort of saying things that American policymakers for many years have done a good job at couching in more liberal sort of freedom terms, but he's sort of saying what they're actually practicing on the ground in many ways, right? I mean, so to what extent is it sort of created an opportunity for us to speak, louder about what's really going on the ground? I mean, maybe the same question can be asked about Netanyahu and those on the right. There's a part of me as a Palestinian that wants them to keep winning elections in Israel. Well, they've never killed us more than the ones on the left, right? I mean, we get killed equally. So, I've always had this theory that if Netanyahu and Trump had enough time together, they could liberate Palestine by accident, So, so to what extent do you find it sort of maybe a little bit refreshing and sort of lent itself more to, letting us discuss things in a more open way here?
That's a great question, and there's a part of me that very much agrees with that. So I'm of two minds on this. So on the one hand, there's absolutely a way that Trump and Netanyahu are moving in ways, like you said, that don't radically reshape politics on the Middle East. In America, I think there is some difference, because Trump as president has made people's lives worse materially, right? He didn't just make certain things plain. Like if you're a trans person in the military, your life is different, right? If you're a person who lives on below the poverty line, your life is different. We can go on down the list of things that Trump has materially made different. And I would argue if you are in if you're in Ramallah or Jenin or maybe not El Beida, but if you're it's kind of fancy. But if you're in the West Bank and you no longer can go to an UNRWA school or the resources aren't there, then there's a material difference. And so as an intellectual and as someone who's upper middle class, there's some ways that I can almost, it's a kind of privilege for me to say that, yeah, if they keep going the way they're going, our ideological point will be made and the radical leftist revolution will happen and we'll be free. And I think there's some truth to that, and I'm gonna get there. But I never want to say that, because of my position of privilege, I never want to say that in a way that doesn't acknowledge the people who are catching hell right now because of that. U.S. aid allows people to live. UNRWA allows people, the United Nations Relief Work Agency allows people to live. Those things matter. And so there's a way that I just don't want to ignore that, right? When I look at what he's done in terms of almost not that MBS Mohammed bin Salman would have done anything radically different, but Trump's almost exoneration of the Saudi government almost enables more death. And what's happening in Yemen is only enabled because of Trump, and so forth and so on. So I never want to ignore that, both in the Middle East or here. But yeah, man, when them two get together, it's like a real bad buddy comedy. It's like it's weird to watch the kind of weird mutual admiration, or really not mutual. Netanyahu's playing Trump, right? He's a lot smarter, and so I think in a way he's like a mentor to Trump, which is scary as well. But what I'm watching them do is make plain things that people on the left, and particularly the Palestinian left, with regard to what's happening inside of 48, have been arguing for decades. So when you look at the nation state law, I was there when the bill was being debated in the Knesset in July. And when it became a law, the nation state bill was like, in many ways, just an affirmation of what people were saying all the time. Every Palestinian I talked to inside of 48 and outside of 48, even the ones in Nazareth, they are. Just kidding. Were like, I was like outraged by the nation state bill. I'm like, do you read this? It's saying Arabic is not an official language anymore. And they're like, really, look at the signs, right? Like, literally, look at the signs. They've been taking the signs down for decades. Or if it doesn't say Quds, it says Urushalayim. Jerusalem bil Arabi, I'm saying, not just in Hebrew. So they've already Hebraicized everything. So they're just saying this stuff, saying that settlement expansion is a natural right. They've been doing it anyway. Netanyahu's whole point about facts on the ground, we have to acknowledge, as a way of disregarding international law, has already been happening. So everything that the nation state law says has already been happening. The only people outraged was the outside world, who was now watching what Palestinians have been saying the whole time. They're taking the country brick by brick, right? And it's just an acknowledgement of it. So to that point, I think you're 100% right. Now the world is looking like, oh, wait a minute. As the Israeli government moves further and further to the right, as it has since the 70s, right? As it moves further and further to the right, and as we see more and more authoritarian policies, and in the United States, proto-fascist policies, I think there's more of a galvanizing energy. I think people are like, wait a minute, we have to do something. I know people who don't care about Palestine or who don't care about Palestinians, who watched what happened in July and August of 2014 and said, this is shameful, right? When they watched a 10-year-old boy get arrested last week and when he ran into they're like, wait a minute, this is too much, right? When they watched the evil that it takes to strip refugee funds as a way of really creating a kind of final status situation with refugees. When you watch that and you watch the people who are dying as a result of it, when you're standing as I was in Khan al-Ahmad maybe 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months, 6 weeks ago, and I'm watching this village literally be prepared to be destroyed, made out of tires and mud, right? The school's made out of tires and mud in Khan al-Ahmad, just for the purpose of right, and creating and really being able to consolidate the two settlements so that you could have one long settlement, right, including commercial districts. So even people who don't care about those issues are like, wait a minute, this is too far. Same thing with Trump. I know people, you got regular Republicans who have never voted for a Democrat in their life who are looking at Trump like, nah, bro, I can't do this. There's hope in that, I think, if we act right. But the problem is, and this is what I was saying before, we can't just treat Netanyahu and Trump as people who are of a different sort. We can't treat them as these political aliens who dropped down, who interrupted otherwise normal, fair government policy. That's the only problem. So it's like, I don't want people to just organize to get rid of Trump and then we end up with a Mike Pence. You dig what I'm saying? And there's a whole lot of Likud party members who could replace Netanyahu, who may not be quite as brash and may not commit the same illegal acts around, advertising and fraud and all things he's being charged with right now, allegedly. He might be innocent. But at the core, they still have the same worldview and the same vision. At the core, most of the Republican Party would have the same stance on Palestine.
But look, and the truth is, in the realm of Israeli politics, there's even less difference between Labor and Likud than there is between Republicans and Democrats, when it comes to Palestine.
Yes.
But we Palestinians have found ourselves in the peculiar position of we've been saying things for 70 years, and no one has believed us, and then some of it gets reaffirmed by people who show solidarity with us, starting as early as like you said, the 60s with Malcolm and then Muhammad Ali, and then, of course, Jesse Jackson, the first presidential candidate to actually bring Palestine to the forefront. But then, when do we really get affirmed? When liberal Jews start saying, oh, they're telling the truth. And now, in a weird way, we're getting affirmed by right-wing Jews with this nation-state law. So, we find ourselves in a really weird position. But let me ask you about presidential politics for a second, and then we'll go to the other topics. But so I worked for Bernie Sanders in 2016, and we got a presidential candidate to talk about Palestine. And Bernie's not like in the streets, free Palestine or anything. No. He'd probably be like a member of, maybe like a mild member of JVP if he wasn't, a senator. But he said some stuff about Palestinians deserving dignity and equal rights and that kind of stuff, and obviously radical. That's monumental. Yeah, very radical on a presidential stage. And it's an important lesson to everyone out here too. Why did Bernie do that? Bernie did that. Of course, he believes it, right? But he did it because activists and mostly Palestinian, got in his ears and told him, if you do this, we can deliver for you politically, right? And he decided to take that political risk, and then he ended up winning Michigan and was able to stay in the primary all the way through the convention. And so while Jesse Jackson was the first presidential candidate in 1984 to talk about Palestine on a national stage, but he ended up being a fringe candidate as far as numbers, Bernie was able to show that Palestine doesn't have to be a political liability or a political death knell, and you can almost become the nominee. Well, he would have, other than cheating by the Democrats. So he could have become the nominee, and probably will this time. And one could make the argument that led directly to the elections of Rashida and Ilhan and now MoveOn.org telling people to skip AIPAC. And now you have like 6 presidential candidates saying that they're going to do that, which would have been completely unthinkable. Like 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, when Bernie skipped AIPAC, everybody told him that was political suicide.
Exactly.
And now MoveOn is telling people to do it.
Right.
So what have you?
Woo. That's progress.
So my question to you is, how do you think Palestine will play out in this next presidential, on the Democratic side? Forget about the Republicans for a second. On the Democratic, we know what the Republicans are going to do. They're going to use it against the Democrats. Trump has already said Democrats hate Jews and all that kind of stuff. Well, what's going to happen? What do you think is going to happen on the Democratic side? And what have you seen already happen in this presidential race with the candidates that we have so far vis-a-vis Palestine?
So there's not going to AIPAC is a huge shift, right? It's a radical shift in American politics. Going to AIPAC was like, you had to go to AIPAC, you had to go to the Evangelical Church, you had to go to Iowa and New Hampshire and get some maple syrup on your pancakes in Vermont. There were all these things you had to do that were just part of the presidential process, nomination process. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I think avoiding or not having to go to AIPAC, I think, is a powerful thing because it's another, like, there was a moment where AIPAC was like undefeated. Right. Where it felt like any political battle untouchable. Yeah. Then there was the Iran deal.
Right.
And then it was like, oh, wait a minute. Maybe if we organize and we're principled and we're on the right side of the issue, we can win, right? So in some ways, that's a sign of optimism. But when I look at many of the front runners, take Bernie off the table for a minute. Not because I don't think he's a front runner.
Sure.
I think he will be right in the mix. I think Joe Biden complicates everything.
Yes.
But I love what Bernie has said so far. I don't agree with him on everything on this issue. But I love the courage he's taken. I think he's taken a principled position, and he's hired he's got Matt Duss now, right? As his, he's got some interesting, really strong voices who are pushing him in the right direction on this. But take him off the table for a minute. You got Kamala Harris, who has met with Netanyahu,
yeah,
who has given private speeches to AIPAC, and who doesn't seem to be any closer to a proper analysis of this issue than Hillary was.
So then how much pleasure should we take so even if she's doing it for like cynical, please the left-wing purposes, Kamala Harris has said she's not going to AIPAC.
Yeah, but she don't need to, she is AIPAC.
Right, so I see what you're saying. So you think it's like okay, fine, but do you think AIPAC sort of, what? They understand that, they're excusing her, they sort of like say, okay, we get it, you have to do this?
Her position isn't ambiguous.
No, it's not. You're right.
So yeah, she gets both. She gets 2 for the price of 1. She gets to not go to AIPAC and not upset the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But she's already, it's not even a wink. She's been very clear about what her position is. And I'm not going to assume that Kamala Harris is unprincipled on this issue. I think she's wrong on the issue.
Right.
So let's say she believes this. We know where she stands on it. She's done it. Joe Biden has not been unclear. I think that the Biden-Obama administration has taken the boldest steps of any presidential administration since Carter. And in some ways, George H.W. Bush on certain pieces of it. But none of it is good. Let me be very clear. None of it is good. So I'm not, but my point is, but even their bold step was like not voting.
Right.
Like that's political courage in this universe, right? Is not voting. At the end, right as he's going out, like I'm gonna not vote on this one.
And Kamala Harris stated that she grew up a Zionist.
Right.
She made that statement.
She's very clear about her position. Joe Biden's fairly clear in terms of record in his Senate vote on his position. So we're looking at the people who are front runners. Right. You got Bernie, you got Kamala, you got Joe Biden, you got Elizabeth Warren, who's taken a slightly more principled position than she had a few years prior, but still not a good one by any stretch of the imagination, based on her voting record, based on her recorded statements. So we are light years ahead of where we were 4 years ago, and 8 years ago for sure. But we're still so far from a principled stance.
So I hear what you're saying, all right? I guess my question is, the idea is twofold for the community, though. Intellectually, you're right? We should not, somewhere in the back of our head, we have to go, yeah, okay, fine, Kamala Harris, somebody like Kamala, I'm not picking on Kamala Harris, but somebody like Kamala Harris not going to the AIPAC, yes, we shouldn't.
And Cory Booker, same thing.
But Cory Booker, I don't think has said he's not going.
No, he probably will go.
Yeah,
he's
he's
probably
going.
working the stand.
But
But, I'm saying, but again, even if he didn't, he has such a long record.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and obviously, intellectually, we should all say to ourselves, yes, we shouldn't be taking anything from it, from a substantive policy point of view.
Right.
Okay, but as political activists,
Yes.
should we be yelling and screaming about it and jumping up and down and saying, yeah, this
It's
is
a
an
victory.
important turning? Yes, right.
Politicians don't have feelings; they have interests.
Right.
So the fact that you've been able to leverage
Right.
your power so that people don't make AIPAC a necessary pit stop
Right.
is a victory.
Right.
Giving, and this, forgive me if I sound cynical, but being given permission to say that Palestinian babies are worth as much as Israeli babies, which was a radical statement to make 8 years ago, is now something that you can say as a presidential candidate, right? Again, is it the ideal answer? No, but it's progress. So we should feel encouraged that this work matters, and if we continue to leverage power, our interests will converge with their interests. Again, they're not going to care about Palestinian lives. It's a cynical ploy. It's a cynical ploy. You think the board of trustees at Temple University really cared about or even understood what River to the Sea meant, most of them? No. Certainly not the guy.
They were told what it means.
That's my point.
Right.
Again, not by some secret cabal,
No.
just by the guy next to him on the board. I'm just be very clear, because I need to say this, because every time I give a talk, there's always some informant who comes into the room, and this isn't I read the articles, and then they take something that I said completely out of context, and then they make it something. So I'm saying that Patrick Murphy, is that his name? Patrick Murphy, who was the Board of Trustees chair at Temple University, I would argue does not know about this issue. Yet he feigned moral outrage at it, because that was the political move based on what other people may have genuinely felt. And so, by that same token, that's how all politics work. And so, you know what I mean? People will move on an issue when it makes political sense to. And the fact that you've been able to move on this AIPAC thing, you've been able to move to talk about disproportionate violence after Gaza. Right? The fact that you could actually say, you know what, I don't know a lot about Syria or Golan Heights or Palestine or Israel, but I do know that you can't keep land you take by force. You can't just annex the Golan Heights just because I respect international law. And if we don't, then it destroys the whole premise of post-World War II politics, right? And territoriality and the protection of smaller states by bigger states and sovereignty. I mean, I could talk all that stuff without even mentioning Palestine or Israel, right? So there's space to say that now. You couldn't say that 20 years ago. So I'm saying that's why I said it's a dark moment, but as Dr. King said, it is only when it is darkest that you can see the stars. It is dark, but there are so many signposts of hope, and what you just said is one of them.
And I think it's important for people to understand, for the long time in our community, the discourse has been, well, why should we worry about, maybe getting one of our people into office? They have all this power and all that. But as we've seen, I mean, look, it's just Ilhan and Rashid, just two people. And look at the seismic sort of they've had to have now whole AIPAC meetings and conferences to deal with these two people.
Right. You think it was 200?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's just two people, and it was just one presidential candidate with Bernie, right? So I mean, it really, it is, and the other point when Marc talks about remember when Dr. King was at his height, he didn't have a monument, he didn't have a national, he was an enemy of the state. Same thing with Malcolm. Same thing with Muhammad Ali. These guys were all enemies of the state.
Yep.
So don't ever be afraid, and I think Marc has shown us clearly how to be courageous in front of all of that, despite the consequences. Don't be afraid of becoming sort of a quote unquote enemy of the state. There's a lot of valor in that. All right, I want to go back to Ferguson and Palestine for a second. I couldn't, I wrote back when Ferguson happened that I couldn't see it through anything other than Palestinian eyes because it looked like Palestine on the ground to me.
Yeah.
And to refresh some people's memories, you talked about one of the tweets. Because those are some of my favorite tweets when I saw them come out. But, one tweet said, like you said, remember not to touch your face when tear gassed or put water on it. Always make sure you run against the wind. Keep calm. The pain will pass. We're pretty creative with these things. Don't keep much distance from the police. Don't keep much distance. If you're close to them, they can't tear gas. So this was not just one tweet. It was a barrage of tweets, right, coming through as Palestinians were watching this on TV and literally seeing themselves, right? This notion of someone who thinks that you are not a human being and they also happen to be the people with guns.
Yeah.
That's something that we're very used to.
Yeah.
And so we saw a lot of ourselves in that. Same thing with Laquan McDonald, right? The idea of sort of a kid brashly walking by the police. I see that in Palestine every day. A kid walking by the police like he doesn't care what the police are going to do to him, and then they shot Laquan while he was walking away. And so we see that. We do not express it as much as we should. Yeah. And I kind of want to take what I see happen in our community is that immigrant communities, and it's not just us, okay? But let's talk about us for a second. When we come to this country, every immigrant community, I think, when it comes to this country, has this thing where the first generation especially, just wants to fit in.
Yes.
And fitting into Americanness means fitting into whiteness, because Americanness means whiteness. Even as you might, now that you are, be careful, you can't speak Arabic around Marc, he understands you. So as you start understanding it, we have, even in Arabic, and we translate it into English too, when we want to say, when we want to describe someone who's black, we'll say black, or we'll say it in Arabic, whether it's the good word or the bad word. If we want to say Latino or Mexican, we'll say Mexican. But when we want to say white, we say American.
Right.
Right? And it is something that is sort of entrenched in us from even back home. And so this strive towards whiteness means you want to fit in. And when you come to this country, what is the first thing you learn that is the most identifying characteristic of whiteness? Anti-blackness. And so we fall into this trap of expressing anti-blackness almost as a way of thinking, and I'm not trying to excuse them, I'm trying to sort of explain what I see happen in our community, almost as a way of fitting in, right? If you want to be American, it means you got to say terrible things about black people. And then it sort of gets transferred onto generations.
Let me push back on that just a little bit, because that almost would suggest that anti-blackness isn't indigenous to Arab spaces and it only becomes so when you get here.
I think
but there's centuries of
and that's true. And I think it becomes reinforced. Let me say
that I agree with.
When you come here, and I just want to be honest with you. There's 100 people in this room, 150. I don't know how many people are in this room. When you were talking about anti-blackness in the Palestinian community, everybody clapped. I think probably 15 to 20% of them were clapping genuinely, and everyone else was clapping because everyone else was clapping. And we have a lot of work to do. There's too many people in our community and in this room that still feel uncomfortable around strong, unapologetic blackness. And it is something that we do have to get over. So that's my lecture to them. But how important is that to you? So we've seen now in the last year or so, it's all become clear, right? It's been you. It's been William Barber. It's been Cornel West has been doing it for a little while. Angela Davis, Alice Walker, Michelle Alexander in the New York Times. Really seminal column in the New York Times. What has been? Not that you guys have like an email list or a WhatsApp group.
We kind of do.
Okay, all right.
Ain't but 6 of us. So, we kind of do. Yeah.
What has been the discussion, and what have you seen that trickle down anymore to? I mean, do you think that we've reached a sort of plateau, or do you think we're going to see more black activists and intellectuals say, okay, this is the way we got to go now?
I remember maybe 10 years ago, Angela Davis and I did an event at a school. I think it was Gustavus, somewhere in Minnesota. I'm gonna say it wrong. And anyway, and she was talking about prisons. And she was like, she just said, matter of factly, she said, it's crazy that we can come here and do a whole lecture on prisons.
Right.
She said, because 20 years ago, it was such a taboo topic and was so, she said, I couldn't even get I wasn't even permitted to do a lecture about prison in the university. It was taboo, it violated respectability politics. It was just so outside the norm. And now, look where we are.
Right.
I think Palestine is a similar thing. I think as time goes on, it'll become more and more normalized for people to do it. This idea of except for Palestine, right? We talk about PEPs, right? And people who are progressive except for Palestine. That is becoming less and less of a requirement. It's becoming less and less of a tenable position. Let me put it differently. It's becoming a less tenable position. So I think you will see more. And there will always be, someone said to me the other day when the politicians started when politicians started saying they weren't going to AIPAC, they said, damn, Mark, you were just a little too early. Right? In terms of because now it's cool. And I'm like, well, no, you can't be on time unless someone else is early. Right? Someone has to take these hits. And I'm not a martyr. There are many people who've taken, Stephen Saleta has taken a far greater hit than I ever could, my dear friend Stephen. Rick Sanchez, well, I believe Rick Sanchez may have said something anti-Semitic.
That was different.
Yeah, I think that there are people who have been paying a price for a long time for speaking very dangerous truths about a range of political issues. Again, whatever the issue, whether it's gay marriage, whatever the issue might be. And I think we're getting to a point where it becomes safe. And there are people who aren't saying anything right now who are ducking and running or doing the opposite. And in 10 years, they will pretend that they were always here with us.
Right.
And does a part of me get irritated by that?
No, but hey.
Because you know what's going to piss me off? Be honest with you. Just be talking. In 10 years, somebody will be standing on CNN saying free Palestine.
I know. No, look, forget about 10 years. I think there's a good argument to be made that if you said in November what you said today, you might not have been fired.
Right.
I mean,
that sucks.
January,
It really sucks.
But in a weird way, you getting fired had to bring us to the point where
and that's what I'm saying. Somebody got to be early for everybody else to be on time. And I'm saying there's a whole bunch of folk who are early and whose shoulders I'm standing on. Because Angela's been doing this for decades.
Right.
You know what I mean? Cornel West has been doing it for decades.
No, of course. Yeah.
The Panthers have been doing it for decades. So I'm encouraged by it, even if it irritates me a little bit.
What do you take from Angela? I mean, Angela. So as you guys all might remember, Angela Davis was going to get an award from a Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and then the award was canceled and then reinstated. Mm-hmm. I mean, what do you take from? What I'm interested to know. What do you take from the fact that it was reinstated? I mean, and the community down there must have been bombarded by black intellectuals and activists to say, what are you doing?
Black intellectuals, black activists, and everyday black folk who were like, wait a minute, I grew up admiring Angela Davis.
Right.
I know Angela Davis loves justice. I know Angela Davis loves freedom. I know Angela Davis is not anti-Semitic. I know all this stuff, and y'all taking this from Angela, what's going on? See, this is where the proto-fascism and the authoritarianism that you mentioned earlier, the Netanyahuism of it all, and the Trumpism of it all, does move us to a different place. Because if they had given Angela the award, would nobody be paying attention?
Right.
But by taking the award from Angela, everybody knows Angela love. You might be like, well, I don't know Marc Lamont Hill. He's not that known. He ain't been doing this as long. I don't know all his details. We know everything there is to know about Angela Davis, and we know what she's about, right? We know, we can see through her. So we know that she's a good person, she deserves that award. So when she doesn't get it, it makes people say, well, wait a minute, because she's critical of Israel, she can't get an award?
Right. Well, it's like the anti-BDS laws they're trying to pass against us. If they weren't trying to pass those laws, BDS would be a lot weaker than it is right now.
Exactly.
We'll take it.
And there are people who don't support BDS who are like, wait a minute, but you got it. I should be able to support BDS. I don't support BDS, but you should be able to. That's what people are saying.
And I actually want to address, so I had a friend of mine over here yell out, Jewish Voice for Peace, because they were standing up for Angela Davis. But see, that's the point I'm trying to make, is that yes, Jewish Voice for Peace is a wonderful organization. I'm glad they stood up, and I'm glad they stood up for Angela Davis. But that's not what made the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute give the award back to Angela Davis. It was people in the black community, in their own community, that turned around and said to them, what are you doing? That's the point I was trying to make with Marc. Yes, JVP did the right thing, but that's not why.
Because JVP always does the right thing.
Yes, yeah, and JVP is awesome.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that's
not literally, but I'm saying they're on the right side of the issue. On this particular issue, let me be very clear. I'm not making a grand sweeping statement about JVP.
And look, JVP is a good example of what Marc was talking about a second ago of eventually, it's okay if you eventually get to the right place. So like, JVP for a long time, a lot of people in the Palestinian community were like, all right, what's going on with JVP? We're not really sure. Okay, fine, yes, okay. But then finally, after JVP being around for 10 years or however long it's been, 2 or 3 months ago, they finally made a statement as an organization that they are now saying that they're an anti-Zionist organization,
Right.
fully, and we should applaud
Which is
that.
key.
We don't have to say what took you so long. We should applaud that. But the point in Birmingham is that Shuttlesworth turned around because of outrage from the black community,
Right.
Right, and that was really sort of monumental. And okay, the last thing I want to say is and then I'll take it out to the audience. Where's my friend with the microphone? Okay, so if you have a question, Abdul Bari will come to you. Please keep it short and sweet because I know there's going to be a lot and we have to get out of here. The last thing I want to say is that the main sort of really discernible resemblance that I see and that I saw between Ferguson and all the Black Lives Matter movements from Ferguson to Baltimore and beyond and the Palestinians is this. When you are victims of state violence for so long, and for black Americans it's been since before America was established, and for Palestinians it's been since the beginning of Zionism. When something like Michael Brown or Freddie Gray or Trayvon Martin and all these things happen, just like when the nation-state law comes out or Gaza is getting bombarded and children are being killed on the beach, the emotions you see from both communities are very similar. Yes, we are enraged, we are disgusted, we are sad, we are angry.
Yeah.
But the one emotion that you see absent from both of our communities' reactions to these things is shock.
Yeah.
Never shocked, right? White people are shocked now because they're like, oh my God, this is happening to black people, and black people are saying, hey, we've been saying this has been going on for 200
Right.
years. And same thing with Palestinians now, that finally people are starting to listen to us. But to me, that is the thing that binds us the most, that we are people who have been out, because it's been so normal to devalue us, our dehumanization has become so normal.
Yeah.
And so when we speak up, people are less likely to believe us. And so we need other people to speak up for us in a weird way. In this case, as Palestinians, we need other people to say, yes, they're suffering. And it's the same exact thing that happened with black Americans, right, in this country. Before white Americans stood up and said, hey, this is going on, nobody actually believed it. And there's still a whole viewership of a whole media channel in America that doesn't believe it. So I guess I want to hear a couple more words sort of from you of what are the 2 or 3 things fundamentally that you think bind the black struggle here in America and the Palestinian struggle, if you had to button it up, and then we'll go out to the people.
Yeah. Let me preface that.
As talking points for them, as talking points for everybody here.
Yeah, I mean, and let me preface this by saying that our
When
situation.
they're explaining, to their moms and dads and their aunties and uncles why we have to stand up for Black Lives Matter, why we have to, why we have to stand up for Black Lives Matter, and why we have to do this in our community.
It's a great question. I think, let me preface this by saying, I think there's a way that we should just be committed to justice, and that our commitment to justice shouldn't hinge upon our similarity, right? Because there are moments, even when I lead people on delegations, and they're like, okay, I can understand what it means to be a Palestinian in '48, and you can't live in this neighborhood because that's kind of like redlining, right? These admissions boards in the Galilee that it's like redlining, and yeah, I get that you can't go to certain schools because we went through that in the '50s and '60s, and so there's always this point of like trying to compare. And then there's this moment where you talk to somebody who just is stateless,
Right.
And you're like, what are you comparing that to? As messed up as Black life is in America, it's not the same thing.
Sure.
As being in I don't know in Tul Karam refugee camp as a permanent refuge,
Or in Jordan or Syria.
or in Jordan or Syria where you're an externally displaced
Sure.
refugee, and being stateless, right, in a certain kind of way. Black folk don't have that comparison. There's a way that oppression and racism and white supremacy functions in historic Palestine, but it's still not quite the same as what black folk got to deal with a certain kind of white supremacy that says you have the wrong hips, lips, noses,
Right.
you know what I mean, worship, culture, and where your fundamental humanity is called into question in a different way. So there are things that we can compare, and there's things that we can. But I don't want you to have to invest in me or support me or fight for my freedom and dignity and humanity because you see yourself in it. I need you to do it because it's the right thing to do. Now, so I just want to establish that stability
Sure.
first. Now that said,
Yes, that being said.
I think there are some things we should be thinking about. I think one is the vulnerability of each of us to state violence. We all, I mean, if you go, again, I spend most of my time in East Jerusalem. If I sit in Via Dolorosa in the Old City and just sit across from the Armenian hospice, right? You sit, there's a great restaurant, Basti, right there, right? You sit there, and if you sit there for 20 minutes, you will watch, I mean, you can set your watch to how Palestinian youth are stopped and frisked, asking for the Hawiyah, right? I mean, you can set your watch to it. It doesn't matter when it is. If it's a high security season, whatever that means, then it's more. If it's a Sunday morning, it'll be less. But you can guarantee that within 5 minutes, somebody's going to be stopped and frisked, right? And that's no different than New York. And if they offer any type of resistance, the first response is violence, right? Sometimes there is no resistance, right, and there's still violence. Sometimes they're running away, like Walter Scott in South Carolina, or many Palestinian children. Violence, right? We were in Ramallah in November, and for like, it was hard to get in, maybe it was January. It was hard to get in and out of Ramallah because Israeli police were coming in every single night into areas and villages looking for somebody. But in the process of looking for one person, homes were disrupted. You're watching people being attacked. You're watching people being falsely detained and arrested. All these things. The criminal justice system does not work. I mean, the Israeli military court, and if you live in the West Bank, you're being seen by a military court. Is it 97.9 or is it 99.7?
The conviction rate?
Yeah, conviction. Either one ain't
They're
good.
very good.
Right. So either they have right. It's like Matlock over there. It's like 200 Matlocks, or
It's like Saddam Hussein's victories.
exactly, exactly. It's like either Palestinians are really guilty all the time, or there's no opportunity for a fair hearing. We look at that in the United States as well. So we see kind of we see the structural thing. We see displacement, right? You look at marginalization, you look at erasure. All of these things are things that we share. And again, the other thing we share is a government itself that collaborate in ways that undermine both of our abilities to get equal rights. So it's not just that the United States and Israel are similar, it's that they actually work together. Any American politician worth their salt will tell you that they're our closest friend, their closest ally, treasured friend, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Unbreakable.
BFF, unbreakable, you know. And so with that kind of political arrangement, and I mean, we see similar things in Saudi and increasingly in Egypt, but nothing like what we see in Israel.
No.
When you see that kind of arrangement, then you also understand that our oppressions aren't just tied together vis-a-vis.
It's not theoretical.
It's not just theoretical.
Yeah.
We're actually funding these projects, and we're actually training police, and we're actually sending students and clergy over there, and we're actually, you know, so all these things are happening in ways that intensify this. So we're in this together. And sometimes you got it better, sometimes I got it better. But I'm gonna tell you something. If I'm in first class and you in coach and the plane crashes,
Right.
that don't mean a whole lot. So we all gotta support ourselves. I'm not supporting planes crashing. Be very clear, you know, gotta be clear, man.
Yeah, I mean, there's no hierarchy of hurt, right? There's
Exactly.
no measuring activism, measuring suffering, and that kind of thing. You know, the Israeli ambassadors have been quoted as saying to their American counterparts in the UN, you had your Indians and we have ours. Right. And they could have easily said, you know, you had your black people, we have ours.
Right.
It's the same exact thing. You know, the erasure of a history, the denial of a, you know, when I watch the Food Network and, you know, you have
Israeli
all
hummus.
these like Israeli hummus, or you have, you know, white Southern female chefs making black food, you know? I mean,
That drives me crazy.
I mean, right?
I don't know which one makes me madder at this point.
Right, right. So I mean, it's the same. I mean, it's the same thing. It's either appropriation, denial, or complete sort of misinformation about both of our cultures as a way to justify our dehumanization and subjugation.